We've all been on the wrong side of the law in GTA. You know how it goes. You drive your motorcycle into a police station, try to get it up the stairs, and a few moments into clay helicopter shooting, it's already escalated to a 5-star wanted level. You lead the police on a merry chase across the whole city, and if you decide to stand and fight in an epic showdown, it always ends the same way. But today, I got to experience the other side of the chase as I was on duty as Officer Billy Macleod, on loan to become part of a 5-star task force to bring down a heavy crew that were trying to pull off the casino heist of the century. However, little did I realise that some of my colleagues were just as bad as the criminals, maybe worse. But how did I work my way up the ranks to such a prestigious unit, you may ask? Well, the trouble with getting to work on time was that it made the day so long. Morning patrols are normally quiet, but dispatch informed me of an assault in progress. Some animal taking advantage of an innocent man, but it turned out that when she said animal attack, that's exactly what she meant. It was time for me to become the hero that Los Santos deserved.
Nope.
Well, I had the heart of a hero, but the legs of a coward, apparently. Besides, dispatch alerted me to something more serious. An active shooter was gunning people down in the street. Something about a disagreement over the last bagel in a cafe. Words were said, automatic machine guns were drawn, and I was the closest unit. I'd forgotten to have my porridge that morning as I drove into oncoming traffic at the lights, which would be fine if our shooter didn't open fire.
4. David, 22, is on scene.
Now's probably a good time to mention that I don't normally carry a firearm because I'm from Scotland. We solve our problems with words, but when words fail, baseball bats take over. This was no longer about protecting the public though, because I was on an empty stomach and that bagel would be mine. I did things in the order you should, recovered the bread, then secured the firearm.
Subscribe to the Daily Rag.
Now the real work would begin because our shooter had left famished victims lying on the road. I was lacking first aid kits, but wafting tasty baked goods can be just as powerful as any defibrillator. One by one, I promised each lady a bite of my bagel, a promise I'd never be keeping due to reasons I'd fabricate later on, but for now, I had to help the EMTs because they were short-staffed. I mean, it's not like paramedics were falling from the sky now, were they? Anyway, my job here was done, so I respectfully frisked the suspect for weapons and radioed dispatch to tell All of a sudden it felt like this place was about to turn into World War Z over a bagel, so I hightailed it back to my patrol car, dropped Karen off at the local police station, and by the time I escorted her to a cell, realised that this boat was taking on water and I had multiple gunshot wounds. But the healing power of the bagel restored me to full health and I went back on patrol all by my lonesome. Now the reason I worked alone was due to other officers' refusal to partner up with me, because apparently I snore so loudly that it scares the passengers in the car I'm driving. The day got busier as a store robbery was reported in progress. I'd shaken off my wounds and I was back on form. Other officers had already arrived on scene and looked as if they required a spiritual leader to help them deliver the Lord's justice. So I was happy to oblige. I quickly realised that the motto of the LSPD seemed to be something along the lines of, if a suspect is twitching, keep firing, and when they're still, go grab a box of donuts, because they didn't seem to care one bit. But I did, and I was determined that these criminals would stand trial for what they'd done. By the way, either I was getting really good at CPR or my breath still stank of bagels, but whatever it was, the vigour of life gushed through the villains' veins and they were back to their wicked selves. Seemed that no one had noticed there was a bag of cash on the floor, but happily I picked it up knowing that my Friday night was sorted. Strangely though, the poor cashier was inconsolable. But as I shut the store and called for backup, a defiant customer barged in, determined to pick up a new pair of sandals. I reminded him that the store was closed, but...
My turn, motherfucker!
Apparently the barefoot freak had a friend, so I educated them on how a police cordon works. While my colleagues extracted the robbers from the shop, I decided to escort the sandal man to the back, then told him to reflect upon his behaviour. This day was going quite well. Well, that is until I realised I left my keys in the ignition and someone had just GTA'd my car. I did what anyone would do in this situation and arrested the first person I saw running in my direction. The boys at the station were never going to let me live this down, so this crime would be one that I'd solve myself, and the only way to do that was to commandeer a civilian vehicle. Our car thief had gone on a tour de Los Santos, but with air support now tracking our prey, it was only a matter of time before I'd catch up to them. The hunt was on and nothing would get in my way now.
Taxi!
Well, I mean, it was only polite to pick up the poor guy. After all, I could distribute a bit of compensation for that inconvenienced taxi driver that I'd left on the side of the road. No, who was I kidding? I was keeping every penny. Didn't take long to catch up with the thief, and the temptation to tase her right in the cheeks was great. But then I realised that she'd actually stolen someone else's squad car, which meant mine was still at large. Only thing left to do was drop off the passenger, who we gave a very reasonable discount to. I only charged him a measly $245. Then I returned the taxi to its rightful owner. I was on my way to a diner when a call came in. There was a terrifying shootout on the freeway between cops and a heavily armed gang. I was later hailed a hero for my actions, but I wasn't watching the road when this happened. Nevertheless, the gang was defeated and I made sure that we had one living suspect to take the blame for any and all crimes committed. But my legend grew to the point of being loaned out to the task force on my next call, the one call that all cops fear, facing a criminal who had watched every Terminator movie and had enough money to outgun the entire police department. I caught up to the maniac at the pier and his eyes seemed fixed on me and me alone. At least the civilians here stood a chance, but I was worried about surviving long enough to deliver the Lord's justice. So we went for roadkill, round 2. But the Terminator remained, and that left me with the only tactic I knew: park the back wheel right on his head, which was about as useful as an ejection seat in a helicopter, so it was time for tactics that he would not expect. No, not that. There was a misclick there. And let's just move on, alright? As I cowered behind the boxes, wondering how bulletproof they actually were, backup had arrived and they unloaded their ineffectual weapons into the suspect. But all that metal he was wearing might be susceptible to the one weapon I had on my belt: a taser. With 100,000 volts coursing through the suspect's veins, he dropped his weapon and gave up. Trouble was, the rest of the police force refused to accept his surrender and kept firing. As my colleagues screamed at me to stand away so they could, and I quote, waste the sucker, I refused, which was apparently the green light for them to add collateral damage to the mission orders. Lucky for us, we escaped, and taking the Terminator to a jail cell was the safest place he could possibly be. That is, until the other officers finished their shift, but that would be a problem for another time, because my bravery was awarded with my fellow colleagues nominating me for a special assignment. Arriving at my destination, I was to meet with the Special Operations Commander, who we almost immediately mowed down. Not a great start, but then he proceeded to lay out the plan, which was quite simple. There was a large money heist going down at the casino, so I'd go undercover, arrive at the building in a stealthy vehicle and wait for the suspects to arrive. SWAT would then rock up, we'd neutralise the robbers, I would then go grab the swag, pop to HQ and then pose as a getaway driver taking a dummy truck to the airport that was planted with a bunch of GPS trackers, and we'd bring down a master criminal thanks to this ingenious switcheroo. I'd then return to the commander for a debrief and the job would be complete. Sounded easy enough. Step 1 was to get changed. My pants instantly chafed and I realised it was time to cut back on those bagels. But the mission was off to a rough start when I followed the GPS to the undercover car, only to realise that I'd broken into someone else's vehicle and then drove it into a tree. Eventually I figured out that the actual car was behind the house against the wall. But the hardest part was what came next, and that was driving within the speed limit, something which caused my muscles to clench, in fact muscles that I didn't even know existed. But we made it there without a scratch, and all I had to do now was wait. Eventually the security truck arrived, and that was the cue for every SWAT vehicle in the city to descend upon these criminals. One thing that I did not explain to the commander was that I don't carry firearms. However, I did carry fire, and the villains were overwhelmed by our superior tactics. Once again, I proved that you don't need guns to arrest the most violent of criminals, and the leader of the gang surrendered peacefully. I was becoming something of an expert in CPR and found that you don't even need to place your hands on the victim's chest to resuscitate them. But as I performed my distance healing on a second assailant, the Special Operations team began to behave suspiciously, as if aggravated by me keeping these robbers alive. I requested an ambulance to let them know how serious I was that the situation was under control, but that did not dissuade my colleagues from taking matters into their own hands. I was supposed to pick up the duffel bag and get out of here already, but the police brutality was real. And while one of the gang lived long enough to get stretchered out of here, I feared the others wouldn't, so I disciplined one of the officers. Things got worse, and I was outnumbered.
Pinhead.
At least this chap seemed like he'd make it. Oh yeah. There was still one suspect left though, and he wasn't moving, so I shoved one of those bullies out of the way to tend to his wounds, which is when it happened. Shot in the back by a fellow officer. The money then somehow disappeared, and the operation was still considered a roaring success with promotions all round. Except for me, I ended up on traffic duty. But karma found its way to members of that SWAT unit as one of the off-duty officers got involved in a road rage incident and had smashed up someone's car with a crowbar. Unlike those barbarians, I handled the situation professionally, spoke to the victim, and it turned out I'd arrived before physical harm had befallen him. So off he went to the repair shop, and this dirty cop was going to the windows. Yeah, well. Unfortunately, our perp became aggressive and headbutted my fist. Then his car rolled away from the scene, landing on the train tracks. This was only the beginning, as today I sent a message to corrupt cops everywhere that they couldn't hide from the Lord's justice, and the harbinger of their doom was me, Officer Billy Macleod.